went into the store and there was only one person in there. And that was the lady behind the counter. And she was just crying. And I went up to her and I said, "Why are you crying?" And she could hardly speak. She said, "Oh, my precious little mother just died last week." I said, "How old was she?" 84. "Oh, but I know if she could, she would come back to earth to be with me." I said, "Ma'am, are you a servant of Jesus Christ?" "Oh, yes." "And was your mother a servant of Jesus Christ?" "Oh, yes, my mother loved the Lord." I said, "Then you're being plain stupid." And she was so shocked, she stopped crying. I said, "Yes, I know you miss your mother, but don't you realize that once she's in the presence of Christ, she wouldn't even consider coming back to earth?" "Well, I don't know that for sure. I think she would want to come back here." I said, "Let me go to my car and get my Bible. You obviously need to learn a few things." I had similar experiences, and the Lord spoke to me. He said, "It is time. I want you to begin to teach my people about death." Hebrews chapter 2. Verses 14 and 15. "Inasmuch then as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage." One of the things that Jesus accomplished when he died on that cross and rose from the grave was to set his people free from the bondage of the fear of death. Now, in Psalm 116, verse 15, it says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saint." It tells us in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27, it says, "It is appointed unto man once to die." Do you know that you have an appointment with death? Do you know that God has an appointed time already set for your death? If you are a servant of Jesus Christ, God has planned for your death just as carefully as he has planned for your life. No Christian dies by accident. The death of every Christian is directly under the control of God himself. Satan cannot take your life. It is God who supervises your death. Most people do not experience these things, but it's because he wants me to teach you, and therefore he had to teach me. Now, when I was in medical practice, I was in terrible warfare. There was only one person in the whole earth that understood what was going on in my life. There was only one person on earth who understood God's call on my life. And there was only one person on earth who gave me any kind of support. And that was my precious mother. She was 76 years old, in excellent health, and she worked as the receptionist in my medical office. And one day the Lord spoke to me and he said, "Satan has petitioned for your mother's life because he says that if she dies, you won't serve me anymore." He said, "But you have been a faithful servant, so I am giving you the choice. Should we prove Satan wrong or not?" I said, "Lord, I can't make that decision. I don't have that kind of wisdom. You know what my mother means to me." But you see, I had learned by then. I had been very impressed with the story of King Hezekiah. Remember, God sent the prophet Isaiah to King Hezekiah, and he said, "Prepare yourself, you're going to die." And Hezekiah cried and carried on. And he said, "Oh Lord, no, spare my life." And finally, God in his mercy did. And he gave Hezekiah 15 more years to live. Now, what happened in those 15 years? His son Manasseh was born, and Manasseh was the most evil king that ever reigned in Israel. Manasseh led God's people into more evil than any other person on the face of this earth. And also during those 15 years, Hezekiah sinned against the Lord horribly. And he showed all of the temple to a pagan. He took the pagan representatives of the king of Babylon right into God's temple. Who was I to decide whether my mother should live or die? Brothers and sisters, I am cautioning you. All you think about is what you want. What would be best for you, you think. but God can see the end from the beginning. And so I said, Lord, you decide. You do what is best for my mother and what will bring you the most glory. And the Lord said, okay, I will bring her home in exactly 2 weeks from today. But you cannot tell anyone. 2 weeks from that day was Christmas Day. I went to my parents' house. I bought Christmas presents for my mother that I knew she would never use. I fixed dinner for them and gave them the best day I could give them. And then the Lord spoke to me. He said, it's time for you to leave and return to your own home. When I did, about a 45-minute drive, as I walked in my front door, the phone was ringing, and it was my father. And he said, your mother has had a terrible heart attack, and she's in the hospital, and she's being admitted to the coronary intensive care unit. So I turned around and I drove back to the hospital, and a couple of hours later, as we were sitting in the waiting room, and she told my father, she said, your wife is requesting to speak to you and your daughter. So we went into her room, and there she lay on the bed, hooked up to all the IVs and the monitors, but her face was shining. And she said to us, she said, Jesus was just here. And he stood right there beside my bed. He talked to me, and he told me that he was going to give me a choice. He said that he would heal me, and I could go home this morning, or he would take me home to be with him in heaven. And she said, I asked him if I could discuss it with you two before I made my decision. And she turned to my husband. She turned to my father. And she said, my precious husband, I know how much you love me. And we have lived together for more than 40 years. She said, I don't want to be selfish. You just don't know what Jesus is really like. She said, I have to tell you now that I've seen him. I really want to be with him, but I won't go if you don't want me to. And in the act of purest love that I have ever experienced, my father took my mother's hand and he said, you are the most precious thing to me in this whole earth. I wouldn't hold you back for anything. He said, I know it's better to be with the Lord. And he said, you just go ahead. And she turned to me and she said, what do you think? She said, the Lord has shown me I am your only support. I am the only one that knows what's going on in your life. Do you want me to stay? I said, no, I already knew today was your day. You go on home. She said, okay. But my mother was a spunky little lady. She wasn't finished yet. And she had a daughter who was a doctor. She knew what went on in the hospitals. And she knew that if her heart stopped, that they would call a code to try and restart it. And so she turned on her nurse's light. Now, mind you, this was in the middle of the night. And when the nurse came in, she said, young lady, who is the doctor that is in charge of this unit? And the nurse said, well, it's Dr. So-and-so. And my mother said, call him. And the nurse said, well, he's asleep. And my mother said, I don't care. Wake him up. Tell him to get my chart and to get in here. And so eventually he came, and we knew what happened because he came out to talk to us. And when he came to her bedside, she said, young man, is that my chart? And he said, yes. She said, open it up. You're going to write an order in there. You see, my Jesus is coming to take me home tonight, and I don't want you interfering. She said, I want you to write in that chart, do not resuscitate. And so the doctor came out to us. I said, do you know what your wife has asked me to do? She said, she has a chance for recovery. And my father said, no. Jesus is coming to take her home tonight. You honor her wishes. And 2 hours later, Jesus took her home. But God wasn't finished. He yet had more to teach me. Now, my mother never cut her hair. It was very long. It was down to her knees. And so my father wanted her to look nice. But anyway, the funeral home called my father. And they said, we're very sorry, but we do not know what to do with your wife's hair. Would you have a family member that could come down and fix her hair? My father said, oh, yes, that's no problem. I'll send my daughter right down. And so I had to go down and do my mother's hair. Now, that was not easy. But when I finished, as I walked out of that room where her dead body lay, suddenly, for just a few seconds, God parted the veil between the spirit realm and the physical realm. I heard my mother's voice audibly. I would recognize that voice anywhere. And she said to me, oh, honey. And I looked up, and there she stood, hand in hand with Jesus. She was young and beautiful. And she didn't look anything like she looked here on earth. Instantly, I recognized her.